Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 20, Nowhere to Run. Ra sat in his private chamber, seething like a basket full of vipers. Barely in control of his temper, he waited for the pilots to return with the clever vermin who had come through the Stargate. He was rehearsing the exact manner in which he would make them pay for their crimes against him when he felt a tug at his sleeve. One of his servants, a 10-year-old boy, had come to notify him that the Udajit pilots had returned. For no reason, Ross slapped the child hard across the face, knocking him down. As soon as he had done so, he felt much better, relieved. Then the eternally young king stepped out of his chamber and mounted his throne, composing himself for his visitors. The pilots, a pair of Horus guards, marched quickly into the room, deactivating their helmets. They came to the base of the stairs leading up to Ra's throne and knelt down. Anubis, his armor still stained with blood, came into the room and stood at Ra's side, looking down at the two empty-handed warriors. Ra fixed his eyes on the soldiers, and very calmly he hissed the question,
"Where are they?"
"They vanished." Anubis furiously came down the steps and kicked the soldier who had answered the question. "What do you mean, vanished?" The other soldier spoke up. "They are still in the sand. Surely the sandstorm will kill them." Losing control of their small planes in the wind, the Horuses had searched as long as they dared. Waiting any longer to turn back would have meant certain death, so they decided to head back and take their chances with Ra. As angry as he had ever been, Ra stood and walked across the room to his jewel box. The box opened automatically as he approached, revealing its contents. A coin-sized quartz jewel connected to looping ornamental strands of black wire. The wiring fit around the boy king's hand like an elegant, fingerless glove, hiding the quartz jewel in the palm of his hand. Calmly, he turned and came back toward the anxious pilots. He motioned for the man who had spoken first to stand up. Nervously, the soldier complied. He wanted to explain why he had cut off the chase, but Ra signaled that everything was all right now and to be quiet. He came face to face with the soldier and showed him a reassuring smile.
"You tried."
He said, slowly reaching up to stroke the man's cheek.
"I know you tried."
He studied the pilot's face for some time, regarding him, it seemed, tenderly. But his hand suddenly flew open only inches from the pilot's face. When he saw the medallion in Ra's palm, the loyal Horus guard had a fraction of a second to contemplate how his life was going to end. The dark glove's jewel came to life and slammed the man backward against a pillar like a wrecking ball. Slowly, Ra moved in for the kill. He reached out and brought his hand down toward the dazed man's skull. The Horus knew that if the jewel touched his head, he would die. But he was only half conscious, unable to do anything but watch his death happen to him. Ra's hand came gently to rest on the head. Immediately, the man's legs shot out stiff, and his whole body began to spasm violently, as if he were receiving an electroshock lobotomy. The head itself began to vibrate at an unnatural rate of speed, then suddenly went still. Over the next few seconds, the man's facial features began to distort radically. The skull lost the integrity of its shape, swelling and constricting like a thin bag of water. The ring's jewel worked on the same principles as the Stargate's, but here the quartz was put to much more sinister purposes. As Ra held the jewel down tight on the crown of the man's head, he was actually rearranging his molecules, liquefying him from the inside. As serenely as if he were watering flowers in the garden, Ra stood over the man, distracted from his own pain by this hypnotic display of gruesome magic. When his victim was dead, he closed his hand around the deadly gem and sighed. Calmer now, he walked to the other terrified soldier and ran a finger down the curve of his nose.
Let this serve notice. I will not accept failure.
He turned and walked back into his chamber. Outside, hurricane-force gusts came streaking through the desert with enough force to play the dunes like a giant wind instrument. Fighting their way through the blasting sand, O'Neill and Daniel held tight to Littlebit's hairy flanks. The hoods of their robes were pulled down past their chins. The air was so thick with dust their eyes were useless anyway. Fatigued, Daniel stumbled and fell into the sand. The mastage halted its progress, turning back and howling even louder than the wind. O'Neill pulled his mask away from his eyes and fumbled around the dune until he found Daniel half buried in the sand. The mastage continued screaming into the storm as O'Neill walked Daniel back up the dune, but then suddenly trotted away, disappearing into the abrasive night. O'Neill, thinking fast, tried to have Daniel call to the animal before it got out of range, but it didn't work. He couldn't understand why this mastage would suddenly jilt her beloved, stranding them both in the storm. In spite of their screams, the animal was gone. O'Neill hauled Daniel to the top of the dune where they both sat down. They were about as far up the proverbial creek as anyone could get, and their paddle had just jogged off into the desert. O'Neill pulled his hood tighter over his head and felt the sand gathering around him, slowly burying him alive. Half an hour later, Littlebit came trundling back, howling over the wind as she approached. When the beast was close enough, the marooned men were able to pick out the shapes of several helmeted figures closing in on them. The one in front scrambled to the top of the dune, pulling off his helmet and ski mask, grinning wildly. It was Nabe, the slightly demented shepherd boy. Standing behind him, decked out in the uniform of a United States Marine, was Skara. He squinted at O'Neill through the flying sand and gave him a thumbs up. Propped up by the boys, his eyes swollen closed, Daniel felt his way up the rocky hillside to the entrance of the cave. When Kowalski saw who it was, he lowered his rifle and came to the entrance to help. O'Neill walked into the shelter under his own power and surveyed the scene. A dozen or so of the boys, none of them old enough in O'Neill's view to wear a military uniform, were buttoned into the oversized camouflage togs they'd rescued from the base camp. Stacked against the walls were 24 rifles and several crates of ammunition. Halfway back in the cavern, a makeshift hospital had been set up. Brown, his arm in a sling, was doctoring Ferretti. "You made it!" Kowalski greeted O'Neill with a roar. Now all the surviving members of the team were present and accounted for. O'Neill reached up and clapped the big man on the shoulder, a soldierly greeting, before continuing deeper into the cave for an inspection. He noticed that Skara and Nabe were moving with him, a step behind, as if they were now his personal bodyguards. O'Neill turned and studied them with a disappointed look. "What do you think, Colonel?" Kowalski asked. "They're not exactly special forces, but they're real eager to enlist." Obviously, Kowalski was as proud of the job the boys had done that day as they were of themselves. "Take the guns from them, Lieutenant, before they hurt themselves." "Come again, sir?" "You heard me. Collect the guns and send them home." Kowalski came within inches of exploding. He was fed up with O'Neill coming into situations he didn't understand, situations Kowalski had completely under control, and screwing everything up. "There isn't anywhere for them to go." Kowalski stayed cool, informative. "If they showed up in the city, they'll be executed for helping us. Besides, we could sure use the help, sir." His tone left no doubt who he was ready to stand behind if it came to a choice. For what? O'Neill got in his face, suddenly furious. To do what, Lieutenant? O'Neill's outburst caught everyone by surprise. Stunned, no one knew what to say. To Kowalski, the answer was obvious. The team needed help to get back to the Stargate and safely home. He was bewildered that his superior officer had apparently forgotten the goal of their mission. Daniel, who understood the source of the confusion, propped himself onto an elbow and called out to O'Neill. Why don't you tell them the truth? Tell them about the bomb. Kowalski stared at O'Neill like he might be the new commanding officer and asked him, What's he talking about, Colonel O'Neill? My orders were simple. I was to stay behind and look for any signs of possible danger to Earth. If I found any, I was supposed to blow up the Stargate. Well, guess what? I found some. O'Neill turned away, not wanting to continue this confession. Indignant, Kowalski snapped at O'Neill. Why wasn't I told? It was strictly need to know. O'Neill was matter-of-fact. Need to know? Don't you think this is something I would damn well need to know? You weren't even supposed to be here. None of you were. You were all supposed to go back through the gate with Jackson. Even though Kowalski knew O'Neill was right, he didn't like it. He had been the commander of this operation long before O'Neill came along, and this option had never been discussed with him. He had always understood that the military often moved in strange, mysterious, and often stupid ways, but this was too much for Kowalski to comprehend. There was nothing he could say. Frustrated with the everlasting stupidity of the military mind, Daniel interjected. And this great plan of yours would leave you here with a nuclear weapon? Well, it's his now, and tomorrow he's going to send it back through the gate along with a shipment of the quartz mineral they mine here. Apparently, when the bomb goes off, this shipment will detonate and cause an explosion 100 times more powerful than that bomb alone is capable of. He told you all this? O'Neill asked skeptically. Yes. All right, then. O'Neill stepped forward, reassuming command of the situation. I'll intercept the bomb before he can send it through. Colonel, listen to me, Daniel pressed. It's the other gate, the one on Earth, that poses the threat. Think about it. As long as that one is up and functional, he'll always have access. That's the one we have to shut down. O'Neill hissed back. You're absolutely right. But thanks to you, we don't have that option, do we? He stood up, walked as far toward the mouth of the cave as the sandstorm would allow, and sat down. I knew it all along, Ferretti broke the silence. This was a friggin' suicide mission. It took more than an hour for everyone to calm down and remember that they were on the same side. Daniel was kept busy the whole time explaining what he'd learned inside the pyramid, then translating everything for Shaori and the new recruits. When everything was quiet, Daniel approached O'Neill, who was still sitting at the mouth of the cave blankly watching the sandstorm. So, you've accepted the fact that you'll never go home. O'Neill felt as hollow as he had the day General West's men arrived at his house. All he did was stare straight ahead. Daniel tried again. Don't you have people who care about you? Don't you have a family? I had a family, O'Neill said in a quiet monotone. No one should ever outlive their own child. Daniel didn't know how to respond. Although he'd known plenty of pain in his life, he still didn't know how to respond to the pain of others. It was a brute fact. It was there, beyond the power of words. When his parents died, he'd had to put up with a long line of fools coming up to him saying, "They're happy now," and "It's probably all for the best." He wouldn't try to cheat O'Neill out of his pain with any sugar-coated platitudes. At the same time, he had to do something. O'Neill was sinking fast, deep into some hopeless place within himself, and the team couldn't afford that right now. "Colonel, listen." Daniel was quiet but urgent. "I don't want to die." That caught O'Neill's attention. "Your soldiers don't want to die, and these kids helping us don't want to die. It's a shame you're in such a hurry to." The words punched O'Neill in the gut. He was about to respond, to say or do whatever it took to get Jackson out of his face. But when he looked up, Daniel was already walking away, and Skara was coming toward him, balancing a full bowl of food for his commanding officer. O'Neill watched him spill a few drops of broth over the rim of the dish, his tongue poking between his teeth to help him concentrate. During the altercation with Kowalski, Skara had backed him up, telling the bigger soldier in Egyptian that he'd better back off, or else. "Anasar?" he asked before offering the bowl to O'Neill. Still thinking about what Daniel had said, O'Neill turned and focused on the storm. Skara was confused. He sniffed at the bowl of stew and decided it was pretty decent for cave cooking. Completing his journey, he arrived at O'Neill's side and set the bowl down in front of him. When the man in the black beret ignored him, Skara playfully slid the plate closer. Then a little closer. Then once more. Then, several more times, he invited the colonel to eat. It was the goofiest thing O'Neill had seen for a long time, and he waved the boy off to make him quit. But Skara could see he was winning the battle and wouldn't let up. When O'Neill turned his glum face to show the kid he was serious, to just leave him alone, Skara clucked like a chicken and flapped his wings, something Ferretti taught him a few minutes earlier. O'Neill caved in. It was too ridiculous. He had to smile. "Chicken, right?" "Shikan," the boy repeated with so much exuberance, O'Neill couldn't help but laugh. He reached out and used his fingers to mess up Skara's hair in a spontaneous show of affection. Then he leaned forward and picked up the bowl, accepting the gift the boy had brought him. 20 minutes later, the bowl was empty, and the colonel was gazing out at the storm, his mind on the other side of the universe. He was thinking back to a particular afternoon in Yuma, a clear day in late spring 2 years ago when he'd pulled into the driveway, honked to say he was home, then got the equipment bag out of the garage and threw it in the back of the station wagon. He got back in the car and leaned on the horn, to no avail. He didn't know what was taking the kid so long, but whatever it was, it couldn't be worth showing up late for the very first game of the season. He slammed the car door and went to the front door, which was locked. He had left the keys in the ignition. By the time he was back and unlocking the front door, he sensed that something must be very wrong. The moment he swung the door open, he knew it for sure. He scanned the living room. It was messy, but normal. "Son, you in here? JJ?" He walked into the living room, but by the time he was in the hallway, he was running. He burst into the boy's room. His uniform jersey was hanging on the back of a chair. He went into his own room. The nightstand on Sarah's side of the bed was opened. It was supposed to be locked at all times. That's when he heard the siren and figured it all out. For a minute, he stood there like a statue, staring at the open drawer where Sarah kept the pistol. He knew it was loaded, and knew if he reached for the key taped to the underside of the bed, it wouldn't be there. He kept hoping he was wrong, that the sound of the siren would veer away to some other part of the neighborhood, but it kept coming. He checked Sarah's bathroom. Nothing. Clean. He came back in the hallway and started toward the kitchen, but then turned and ran to the back porch. The siren was almost to their door when he looked outside and saw 2 of the neighbor kids standing in the yard, leaning over his son. There was a long fan of blood spattered across the wall of the garage. The gun was laying nearby in the grass. He hardly recalled opening the door and coming outside, nor hearing the two friends try to explain what had happened. But he remembered the image of the boy's crumpled body, half-dressed for the baseball game, lying bloody and disfigured in the grass. Before the paramedics arrived to tell him what he already knew, he got down in the grass and did something he hadn't done for years. He cradled the boy in his arms, rocking him back and forth. One bullet right through the head. After that, Jack O'Neill Sr. didn't want to move anymore, didn't want to speak, didn't want to go through the motions of grieving for the boy. All he wanted to do was lay down next to his child and die. That's how the paramedic team found him when they came through the gate a few minutes later, the same state Sarah had to nurse him through while she struggled to deal with her own loss. It was the same state of self-loathing and anguish O'Neill was in 2 years later when General West's men came to visit. He just wanted it to be over. When O'Neill re-emerged into the present, Scar was sitting next to him, drawing in the sand on the cave floor, and watching O'Neill think. He'd never met a soldier before, but he knew O'Neill was a good one. He had already made up his mind to be like this man, to become someone with the skills and determination to protect his people. As Daniel made his way to the remote area of the grotto where Shaori had set up her camp kitchen beneath a natural ventilation shaft, he saw something he took as a bad sign. Ferretti and Kowalski were huddled in a conspiratorial conference. When Daniel came close to them, they turned and glared at him until he was gone. Still looking back at the clutch of soldiers, Daniel came to the makeshift kitchen. Sitting around the fire, the shepherd boys were holding their bowls, obviously ready to eat. "Is it ready?" he asked Shaori, who was busy stoking the fire below the small pot. She indicated that indeed it was, so Daniel took one of the bowls and scooped out a measure of both broth and meat before returning it to the amazed child. All the boys stared at him like he had just pulled his tongue out of his nose. "What?" he said in English. One of the kids said something, and all of them, Shaori included, started cracking up. "What?" While the boys continued making jokes too fast and too colloquial for Daniel to catch, each one apparently more side-splittingly funny than the last, Shaori took 2 servings of the food out to the soldiers. Daniel, fed up, tackled Nabe to the ground, pinning him. "Why do you laugh?" he demanded in ancient Egyptian. But by that point, everything was funny, and Daniel's question only succeeded in knocking the boys over backward, laughing even harder. Finally, Nabe regained control of his breathing and explained. "Bani neateruani, he na aniban." Literally, the ones who are husbands do not do this kind of work. "Husband?" The short hairs on Daniel's neck stood up. He rolled off Nabe just as Shaori returned to the room. "Shaori," he switched back to Egyptian. "Crazy boy here just called me your husband." Daniel had meant it to be light-hearted even though he wanted an answer. The boys busted their collective gut, repeating the word, "crazy boy," and pointing at Nabe. Nabe got the joke. He punched Daniel in the arm. But to everyone's surprise, the young woman fled the area, retreating into a dimly lit region of the cave. Like men of all galaxies, they looked at each other understanding they'd done something wrong, without knowing exactly what. Daniel stood up and, after a suitable pause, followed Shaori around the corner. He found her sitting by herself at the very back of the cave. "What is it?" he asked. He realized that she wasn't angry, but somehow ashamed. Nearby, the boys had snuck up to spy on them. Shaori could hear her brother shooing them away. Only when they were gone did she speak. "I'm so sorry. Please don't be angry with me. But I didn't tell them." "Tell them what?" Daniel asked. "That you did not want me." Daniel was puzzled until he realized she meant the night she came to his room in Nagata, the night the townspeople had offered her to him. Now as she was turned away from him, this fragile creature he understood so poorly, feeling ashamed and rejected. He reached out and took her shoulders awkwardly into his hands. His pulse quickened and his mouth started going dry. Sitting there in the dark with this woman he desired so badly, wanting to comfort and assure her. Desiring nothing more than to kiss her, but painfully aware of the many great distances that separated them, how imperfectly they knew each other, and knowing that he would soon have to leave this place or die trying. In spite of all that, he pulled her closer, and when she turned her face to his, began to trace her features with his fingertips. He started having that same sensation of déjà vu he'd experienced the first time he'd seen her. But this time he understood why. This upturned face he held in his hands was the same face he'd loved on Earth, the same face he'd taken with him to Colorado. Shaori could have been the model for the 14th century statuette that had been his greatest treasure on Earth. Daniel felt like he should tell her, explain the whole amazing coincidence. But by that point their lips were too close for words. Too close to do anything but kiss. The first thing Daniel saw when he woke up the next morning was Shaori's face. It was still peacefully sleeping only inches away from his. He thought about everything that had been said and done the night before, and he couldn't help it. He bust out grinning. He rolled on his back, put his hands under his head, and grinned at the ceiling. That's when he noticed Nabe was sleeping only inches behind him, still wearing his helmet, his mouth hung open in a way that changed Daniel's expression immediately. Suddenly, sitting up seemed like an irresistible idea. When he did, Daniel realized that all the shepherd boys had snuggled into a limb-tangled circle around him and Shaori. Obviously, these folks had a slightly different sense of privacy than he did. He could see Skara working on something at the mouth of the cave, white smoke from one of the dying fires wafting everywhere around him. Stepping carefully over the ring of dreaming boys, Daniel tiptoed through the cave to see what Skara was up to. Inspired by the visual history he'd seen in the catacombs, Skara had decided to tell a story of his own. He was sitting on a stone block stool, furiously sketching a scene into the wall. Kowalski, the first one awake, had posted himself to lookout duty, just beyond the mouth of the cave. He nodded a morning in at Daniel, who sat down near the artist to watch him work. Skara was no Rembrandt. He was using a soft red stone to mark down the story of the rescue he had helped to plan. The wobbly pyramid, drawn small, was surrounded by gigantic stick figure boys shooting dots into the air. Hovering above the pyramid, the planet's 3 suns hung just below the pair of gliders maliciously spying on the whole scene. A setting of confused squiggles represented the soldiers kneeling on the ramp, and Ra, a big frown plastered across his face, sat facing them. Daniel's spiked hair and 3 long toes on each foot was shown holding his gun, blasting backward toward the pyramid. Nabe was visible, smiling maniacally, his head shaped like a half-dome. As Daniel settled in to watch, Skara was working on the image of himself. Drawn from his perspective, he became the largest figure on the rough canvas. With one hand he held the long reins trailing across the desert toward a trio of mastages. In the other, his airborne rifle was shooting right through one of the suns. The way he drew his own face changed the meaning of everything else in the picture. His mouth was opened in a ferocious war cry. Daniel watched, fascinated, as Skara repeatedly twisted his own face into an angry mask, then tried to transfer the image onto the rock. Next, it was Daniel's face that twisted. He suddenly realized what he was watching and how important it was. Skara was writing, recording the first history of these people done in many centuries. Daniel, the boyish historian, could not help but love that. For Daniel, wherever there was writing, culture, and a serious attempt to understand the lessons of history, there was hope. The grin came back. Daniel had lucked out and was sitting here in a cave on a different planet, watching the dawn of a new ancient Egyptian culture. It was one of those perfect moments, but one that brought with it a sense of responsibility. Whether Skara's talent as an historian would be allowed to flourish and infect the rest of his people was still in question. They still had to face Ra. As Daniel sat there in the rising sunlight, his mind went blank. He had been staring at Skara's large drawing for several minutes when it fell out of his mouth. The point of origin. His first words of the morning caught in his throat. Kowalski turned around in time to see Daniel digging through the fire for a half-burnt stick. "Jackson, what are you doing?" "The point of origin." This time his voice rang out clearly, tearing through the cave like a wake-up bell. Daniel fished a twig out of the fire, and using the charcoal end of it, traced through the top angle of the pyramid. Then, with another, he drew a line connecting the three suns. The angles were parallel and congruent, like the stripes of a chevron. It was a symbol Daniel remembered from the Stargate. It had to be the seventh symbol, the point of origin, the thing he needed to make good on his promise to get them all home. Neither Kowalski nor Skara understood why Daniel was messing up the boy's artwork. "I found it! That's it! 3 suns above the pyramid!" Now everybody was waking up looking at Daniel. "Here it is! The 7th sign! We're going home!"